Today, we're going to talk about a really delicate subject, mental health. And for all the women watching today, I want to remind you that this show is also for you in maybe helping you understand some of the struggles that men face, the men in your life, but also maybe to equip and empower you with some ideas on how you can help them navigate. Just make sure they think it's their idea, okay? But to help us with this discussion, I am so pleased again to be joined by some of my great friends here today. So we got Justin Shiraz and Coach Drew. And so we're talking today about mental health. And so I'm going to start with you, Coach. When it comes to mental health, how would you define that for people who are maybe trying to get the words that are right?
Yeah. So unlike some ideas where it's just a disease or something that you catch, I believe that everyone has been given a unique capacity, their personality, their ability to think, and all those things. Mental health is your ability to access and to optimize your unique capacity.
Okay.
So it can go up and down depending on stressors and all those kinds of things, but your awareness and your ability to access that and move through those things, I think that's how a good way to measure your own mental health.
Right, so it's not a comparison thing. It's built on who you are, your ability to actually fully maximize that.
Yeah.
I love that. How about you, Justin? How would you define mental health?
Yeah, I think this is a newer combo especially for guys. But for me, it's very simple. It's anything that affects how I think, feel, and act. Okay. Because I think that determines how I deal with stress, how I relate to others, and the choices that I make. So anything that affects how I think, feel, and act.
I love that.
See, that's pretty good. We're having this conversation about men and building a better man. Recently, I was at a conference in the Niagara region. This amazing neuroscientist came from I think South Africa.
Yeah.
And she spoke. It's fabulous. And you look out in the audience, and it was 90% women.
Right.
And we're talking about building a better man in the context of mental health. Why aren't men showing up to events like that? And so when you're defining the word mental health, unfortunately, as soon as you say mental health, it always has this stigma of a deficiency. There is something wrong, and it's a negative. But what if we change that conversation instead of mental health being a negative, but what if we call it mental strength, and now we can build it and get stronger as men and stronger as men. And the more we have that conversation about, hey, mental health is a strength that we can build and get better at.
Yeah, absolutely.
Instead of looking at it as deficiency all the time.
I love that, and that's really come full circle to the things that there's kind of these underlying themes throughout the whole thing. One is identity, but also comparison and this stigma that you have to have it all together as a man. And when you don't, something's really wrong with you. And so you hide, just like Adam, right? You try to cover yourself, which never works with leaves, by the way. And you try to hide from God and from others. And so, yeah, mental health requires you acknowledging. I think when God comes into the garden and says, hey, Adam, where are you? It's not like God doesn't know. It's forcing Adam to acknowledge where he's put himself and that it's okay. God isn't like angry or unable to do something about it. As a matter of fact, he's going to clothe them, but he needs them to come out of hiding. And so what do you think are some of the challenges when it comes to just addressing this issue?
Well, in addition to what you talked about, us not talking about it and having this idea that we need to be perfect, we need to be on our A game all the time, I think there's not enough information and education about what it is and how we actually function. So to make our expectations of ourselves realistic. So when we grieve, which is not just when there's a death, but when there's a loss of something, it could be a job, it could be hair, it could be a season of life. Those kinds of stressors impair our ability to think, to relate to others, to communicate. We're not meant to live under the weight of the stresses that we have indefinitely, but sometimes we think we're supposed to, or I should always be, and I should never be impacted. I should never be slowed down by anything that happens to me, which is an unfair expectation. So I think it's important for us to be talking about how these things impact us so that we can normalize a lot of the challenges that we have as opposed to pretending that we don't have them.
Do you think, just I'll wrap this up before we move to the next thing, but maybe it's just rooted in this lie that we aren't allowed to be weak. And maybe we need to embrace the fact that when we are weak, that's when God is actually revealed in strength. And so I think the other thing is that a lot of times people just think the Bible just talks about spiritual things, and it does, but we are body, mind, and spirit. So What does the Bible say about the mind and how we can navigate this issue? What do you think, Justin?
Yeah. I like what you said, something earlier that really triggered a thought for me, which was come out of hiding. And I think the most important thing in this conversation is to be able to speak about it. I think sometimes as men, we have it's like deep waters pulling out those emotions. And so that process of being transformed in our mind, it requires a step of faith to step out, to be willing to stumble through it. And so I think that, for me, that scripture, that idea of being transformed by the renewing of your mind, there is a daily effort of practicing that. Sometimes it's just speaking it out. Sometimes it's just saying, hey, this is how I feel right now. There's something going on in me. I'm triggered. There's like deep waters in me that I need to somehow access. And as you begin to do that, I think God begins to restore, because you've now allowed yourself to have access, to come out of hiding, to give God control, to say, hey, would you renew my mind? And I believe he will do it.
That's awesome. How about you, Shiraz?
Yeah, in right around the same family of books in the Old Testament, the poetry books, you have the Book of Lamentations.
Right.
To lament,
Yes.
meaning to mourn, to be honest
good.
with yourself about how you're really feeling inside.
Yeah.
Right? And then in Psalms, David, I mean, he's like stereotypical man's man, right? Like he's UFC fighter.
Right.
He's chopping people in pieces. He's out there. He's got to go a whole harem of women. Like, again, stereotypical, this is what a man's man is. And yet, this is the same guy who's in desperation crying out to God on a regular basis, wanting to die. This is a man who the Bible describes as having a heart after God. And he experienced the torment of the lowest of lows in his souls.
Right.
And one of the things I love that he would constantly say, he said, thy word, he would grab a word and he said, I've hidden in my heart. And he would just ruminate on that one scripture. And if that's all you got, it's just that one scripture that you can lay a hold of and keep you going for that day, I assure you God will provide another one tomorrow. And there'll be manna for the next day and the next day, right? And so it's just that concept of get anchored on a scripture. Whatever that is for you for that day, if that's what takes you through to get back to where you need to be to function the way that you're describing it.
What do you think?
Yeah, a lot of wealth there, Shiraz. One of the things that stands out for me in my week this week, focusing on Isaiah 40:31 and waiting on the Lord and him renewing our strength. And it's not just physical strength. It's not just mental strength, it's emotional strength. It's when we wait and when we seek him, when we rely on him, he speaks to us through his word and he builds us up again. But there's this restorative process. And you can't really be restored if you're never really absent of something. That diminishing that happens with us in life, it happens. And he invites us so that we can come to him and be filled again and poured into again. So those scriptures, they speak to me.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you guys, and I think we're all on the same page here, it starts with acknowledgement. I'm struggling. And you need to find some safe place to come out of hiding, whether it's a friendship circle, whether it's a professional, so you start with God. You need to acknowledge where you're at. And then you need to, I think, like we said, we replace the lies that we feel and carry with God's truth. We come out of hiding and then we hide God's truth in their place. And so if you're struggling with mental health and watching this, I want to encourage you, you're not alone. A lot of men battle and struggle, and it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of our culture and our times and the pressures that we face as men. And so I want to strongly encourage you to be honest about that. Talk to somebody. And maybe for the women watching, the men in your life are struggling, encourage them to talk to somebody, anybody. That's where it starts, because none of us were meant to live alone.